Therapists of Reddit, what was your biggest, I know I'm not supposed to judge you, but holy moment? I am a psychologist. I make a conscious effort not to judge, and I generally do well with that. Everyone has their own struggles, and my role is to help, not judge. However, when I was just starting out, I had a patient with a lot of personality issues. He was in a tumultuous marriage, filled with infidelity on both sides. We were talking about how this had impacted him over the years, when he dropped a bombshell, that he had a three-way with his wife and his brother, as payment for a loan his brother had given him. I tried my best to control my reaction, but honestly, I didn't do a great job. He started testing the boundaries of our therapeutic relationship after that, and eventually, I had to refer him out. About a month later, I was working with another patient who was dealing with self-esteem issues when he shared that he and his wife had also had a trio with his brother. I think I handled my reaction better this time, but still, what the heck? 2 patients in 1 month? I haven't had that come up since, but it left me wondering, just how common is it for people to have three-way with family members and their spouses? I worked in a prison for a while after that, and I honestly don't think much would make me go what the F anymore. Story 2. I'm not a therapist, but I used to work at a psychiatric hospital, and you quickly learn not to judge anyone. It's amazing how someone can go from being manic, talking about cutting up their dog to put in waffles, to being a completely normal person in just a few weeks. But there is one woman I'll never forget. She came in for depression and intrusive thoughts. She had been drunk driving with her 17-year-old son in the car when she crashed into a tree, and her son died. He was from my town, but much younger than me, so I didn't know him personally. When she first arrived, she kept to her room. But over the course of the week, she started coming into the common areas, making friends, and becoming loud and obnoxious. After meeting with her doctors, they decided to give her a day pass to attend her son's funeral. On the day of the funeral, she was laughing and joking with her new friends. She left for the funeral, but when she came back, I overheard her telling other patients that she had skipped the funeral to go make amateur corn with her new boyfriend. I know they say you can't judge how someone grieves, but I couldn't help but think about telling her to F off. Story 3. I need to clarify first, I'm not a therapist. I'm just someone who helps out on Discord. That said, I've helped people deal with issues that I'd consider you really need to see a therapist level stuff, trauma, abortion, abusive relationships, and the like. In all my time, I've never felt completely negatively judgmental toward anyone I've helped, except for one person. His main issue was loneliness, no friends, no relationship, the usual. But the problem was, he refused to give any meaningful details about himself. He was a total brick wall. I asked about his hobbies and interests, and he claimed he had none. When I asked about past hobbies, he refused to talk about them, saying he'd been bullied by girls for them. Fair enough, but I needed something to work with to understand him better. I spent hours trying to get him to open up, but all he would say is, "You will not get anything out of me." It felt like he enjoyed keeping everyone at arm's length. He did the same thing with other people on Kind Voice, all while complaining about his loneliness. I thought he was probably in high school or freshly out. Turns out he was in his 40s. He was still holding on to high school grudges and refusing help to move past them. Eventually, I had to ban him because he started guilt-tripping other people who were trying to help. So yeah, he's the one person I genuinely feel judgmental about. His life is the way it is because he refuses to engage with the help being offered, and until he changes that mindset, things will stay the same for him. Story 4. When I was underage, I got caught with a drink on Bourbon Street and ended up with a minor in possession charge. I was telling my therapist about it and mentioned that the police caught me with its hand grenades in New Orleans. He didn't realize a hand grenade is the name of a drink, so I watched him try to process the idea that his patient had just casually admitted to being caught with an actual fragmentation grenade. He paused for a long moment, clearly confused, and then cautiously asked, "Where did you even find a grenade?" I quickly realized the misunderstanding and corrected him, but for that brief moment, I could see him thinking, "Holy crap, how do I even handle this?" Story 5. I once had a patient whose wife had shaken their baby to death. He was seeking help to reconnect with her. At the time, I was a new father with a newborn of my own, and his case triggered intense emotions in me. Fear for my own child, a deep loathing for his spouse, and a kind of pity for him, that's how pathetic kind. I gave it my best effort, working with him for 3 sessions and even meeting his spouse, but ultimately, I had to hand the case over to my supervisor. My supervisor was aware of my initial reactions and did their best to help me process them, but I quickly realized the sessions were becoming more about my feelings than his. I was still early in my career and wasn't fully prepared for how much my personal life could impact my work. Situations like this are expected to come up from time to time in this field, but I was still surprised by the depth of my own response. Story 6. There's been a lot of discussion about pedo as one of the toughest things not to judge, despite our training. I haven't had to treat a pedo, at least not an identified one, thankfully. However, I did run a men's anger management group, and some of those men had committed terrible acts against women. For most of them, I was able to see their positive qualities and find ways to connect, respect, and even admire aspects of who they were. But there were two men in particular I just couldn't find that sense of unconditional positive regard for. One of them rarely spoke during group sessions. He gave one-word answers, complained about how unfair the system was to him, and completely shut himself off. I worked hard to connect with him and get him to open up, but he never did. He eventually left the group after trying to off his girlfriend and going to jail. Thankfully, she survived. The other man was similar in his resistance, showing up late, leaving early, and participating as little as possible. After one session, when we had discussed him staying to the end, he left early again and threatened me when I told him he wouldn't get court-required attendance credit. Oddly enough, I later moved into the apartment below him, completely coincidentally, and would hear him screaming at his girlfriend and smashing things. I called the cops more than once. I do judge these men. They were shitty. Maybe they're redeemable, but redemption requires self-exploration and a willingness to take responsibility, and they both refused to do so. It's worth mentioning how differently I felt about them compared to so many others in the group. With those men, even if their past behavior had been awful, I was still able to find ways to help, respect, and admire them as they tried to change. But these two? They never gave themselves or anyone else that chance. Story 7. Therapist here. This happened early in my career when I was working at a recovery center for families. We had a family come in where the mother had diagnoses of BPD, dissociative disorder, CPTSD, along with domestic violence and battery charges, and a history of addiction. She had a couple of kids. Part of the program involved teaching parents how to relearn healthy ways to interact with their children and use their strengths as parents. I was fresh out of my master's program, and honestly, I felt out of my depth. One of the kids, a young child, became what we call the channeler in the family, absorbing all the anger, sadness, and rage from the mom and redirecting it toward everyone else. We tried working with the mom, teaching her alternative ways to communicate with the kids besides screaming, which was her go-to for everything, grabbing, or restraining them, but she couldn't seem to grasp it. She was still deep in trauma therapy and struggling to process everything. One day we were on a walk, and out of nowhere, the mom body slams the child, who was about 6, onto the concrete floor. Both myself and the other worker were left in complete shock. In that moment, I couldn't help but judge. The kid just looked so scared and sad, and I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pity for them. Story 8. Some of my clients seriously underestimate themselves, and it's honestly mind-blowing. They'll achieve something incredible like maintaining an almost straight A GPA in an insanely tough major while battling depression, overcoming a long-standing phobia to start driving again, writing an entire novel, raising a child alone on a low income, building new relationships after being hurt, or managing OCD well enough to hold down a job. And yet, they'll talk about themselves as if they're somehow failing, as if their accomplishments don't matter. I know this self-perception comes from depression, anxiety, or other challenges, but it's still striking how much their view of themselves differs from what I see. Story 9. I work in mental health, primarily in acute and crisis settings for most of my career. One event that has always stuck with me involved a young person who was dealing with significant and persistent harmful thoughts. They were carrying an overwhelming burden, and I spent a lot of time with them, de-escalating the situation and figuring out the best plan to move forward. Later, one of their parents came in, and with the young person's consent, I spoke with them about their child's struggles and what could be done to support them. Midway through my explanation, trying to share some psychological insights and practical ways they could help, the parent interrupted me with, "Is this going to take much longer? I have a show to go and watch." I've always said that I don't judge my patients. I haven't walked their path, nor have I seen the world through their eyes. But the people around them, the ones who perpetuate their suffering through ignorance, malice, or selfishness, I do judge them. If I can ask one thing of anyone reading this, remember that you can help. Asking how someone is doing, checking in, or simply wishing them well can make a difference, whether they're visibly struggling or not. Please remember, we have all struggled. Be as kind as you can to each other. I hope we all find peace this December and look forward to a better new year. Story 10. I'm a child therapist, and I had a mother report that her 9-year-old son, who had no previous history of bathroom accidents or trauma, suddenly started having accidents at home. This raised some flags, as it could point to a number of things like abuse, anxiety, PTSD, or other stressors. I initially thought I was dealing with something serious until I spoke to the in-home behavioral specialist who was working with the family. She gave me the full story. Turns out, the boy was furious about having to return to school after the COVID quarantine was lifted. In an act of rebellion, he went into his mother's bathroom, took her robe, soiled it, and hung it back up. He also peed inside her dresser drawer. I won't lie, when I heard this, my jaw dropped. Then I couldn't help but laugh so hard I nearly fell out of my chair. Story 11. During my training, I was asked a challenging question. How would you feel if a client came to you and admitted they were a pedo on the verge of committing horrific acts? Could I still see that person as a human being in need of help, or would my personal feelings about such abhorrent behavior prevent me from doing so? This question was a breaking point for some, leading them to decide not to continue to the next level of the course. But it highlights the profound level of non-judgment required in this field. We all have personal feelings, of course, but these are addressed and explored in supervision to ensure we can still do our work effectively and ethically. Story 12. I work at a residential group home, and we had a kid who was admitted about 4 months ago. During a family session, they casually mentioned having parasites, and I was like, what? The mom just nonchalantly says, oh yeah, our whole family has them. We don't believe in getting rid of them because they're part of our biological ecosystem. I was absolutely dumbstruck. After that, we spent the next 3 weeks trying to convince the family that parasites were a serious infectious disease concern, especially since some of the other residents had fecal-eating behaviors and various unsanitary habits that could spread the infection. We spent weeks educating, planning, and, most challenging of all, convincing the mom and the kid that their IQ wouldn't drop just because they agreed to treat the parasites. It involved a lot of CBT work, but honestly, it took way longer than any of us on the team had anticipated. Story 13. I'm a therapist. To build on what others have said, it's very rare for me to experience moments of judgment toward my clients. It happens occasionally, but I'm able to quickly shut those thoughts down and refocus on being fully present for the people I work with. People are so incredibly complex that my judgment wouldn't hold any real meaning, and it certainly has no place in the therapeutic process. That said, I'll admit there's one situation that does get under my skin. When a client's parent tries to sabotage the therapeutic relationship I've built with their child or pulls them out of therapy entirely. This often happens when the work we're doing starts to challenge potentially unhealthy family dynamics. I don't feel anger toward these parents, but I do feel deeply for the child caught in the middle. Story 14. I'm a clinical psychologist who primarily works in forensics, meaning my clients are usually involved in legal proceedings, whether that's family court, juvenile court, or criminal court. My role is to evaluate or provide treatment, not to judge. That's the judge's job. But, of course, I still have my own thoughts. What often strikes me is the justifications people come up with for truly harmful behavior. The one that bothers me most is when parents manipulate their child against the other parent. I once worked with a 5-year-old who said she didn't want to see one of her parents because they hadn't paid child support. I had to pause. Excuse me? What 5-year-old knows about child support, let alone understands it or should have to worry about it? Story 15. Patient perspective here. I had been seeing a therapist for a few months to work on chronic depression, self-harm, and some pretty intense ideation. I tried Suprax in the past, but I didn't like the side effects and gave it up. However, I was ready to try something new to supplement therapy. Everyone around me was raving about Wellbutrin as a miracle and lifesaver, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Since my therapist couldn't prescribe medication, I booked an appointment with a psychiatrist. At my first session, I explained what I was struggling with, what I was doing to manage it, and what I hoped to gain from seeing him. Now, I do a pretty solid job of holding myself together in public. I dress well, I've held down jobs, and at the time, I was living independently. In short, I wear a well-polished mask. I guess it was too good because, about 20 minutes into our very first session, the psychiatrist looked at me and said, "I don't think you're depressed. Bro, we just met. I've been sitting here for 20 minutes, and you're already reversing my diagnosis? Cool story, bro." Story 16. My mom was a psychologist, and though she passed away, these two stories from her practice, decades old now, still stand out. 1. One client spent 2 years in therapy grieving her dog's failed ear surgery. Her dog couldn't compete in shows because it had floppy ears when pointy ones were required. Clearly, there was an underlying personality issue at play. But despite desperately wanting to continue therapy, the client flat out refused to address or discuss anything beyond the dog's ears. 2. Another case involved parents who brought in their troubled child. It quickly became clear the parents were the real problem. They had no interest in introspection, instead trying to convince everyone, CPS, police, psychologists, doctors, that their son was the issue. Their biggest complaints? The kid was growing too fast and costing them money for food and clothes. The tipping point came when the child, a teenager by then, smashed their TV with an axe. At first glance, it sounded extreme. But when my mom dug deeper, it turned out the parents had ignored him for years, spending nearly all their free time watching TV while giving him no attention or care. Otherwise, the kid was well-behaved, calm, doing well in school, no other issues. He'd simply hit a breaking point and had what my mom called a fried green tomatoes moment. The parents refused to take any responsibility and insisted the only problem was the broken TV. The child ended up getting emancipated at 16 and moved out. My mom ran a private practice, and while she rarely expressed judgment, there was one thing she couldn't stand: when someone sought therapy but refused to do the work. Therapy isn't about paying someone to agree with you. You have to show up and you have to, at the very least, try. Story 17. Licensed clinical psychologist here. A big part of my work with clients centers around how not to judge, whether it's our performance at work, our worth as parents or partners, or even our own self-worth. What really hits me are the holy crap moments when I realize just how deeply ingrained our tendency to judge is. No matter how accomplished or resilient someone might be, they often have the capacity to judge themselves harshly, and they often do. What's even more surprising is that we tend to judge ourselves much more harshly than others do. I'm constantly amazed by how blind people can be to their own achievements and strengths, and how unkind they are to themselves. My role in those moments is to help them see themselves with compassion and treat themselves as they would treat a loved one. It's a simple task, but not always an easy one, and I love every minute of it. I'm not sure if this response is exactly what you were hoping for, but it's what comes to mind. Judgment is a simple thing. It's labeling something, a person, an idea, an object, as good or bad. It's something we encounter constantly in life, and it's painfully easy to make. The real issue is that we believe our judgments. But judgments are just thoughts, and like all thoughts, they're not necessarily true. Helping people recognize their judgments and either challenge them or let them go is a lifelong skill to develop. Story 18. 2 situations come to mind. I often work with people in abusive relationships, and it's all too common for someone to return to their abusive partner after leaving. Some studies suggest that the average number of times a person goes back before leaving for good is 7. I understand why people go back. It's a complex mix of manipulation, financial control, gaslighting, love, low self-esteem, fear, and more. But, man, it's incredibly difficult to watch and remain neutral. I can express concern for their safety, but I can't just yell, "For God's sake, stop going back." What will it take? As badly as I want to. The second situation isn't so much about judging a person as it is judging OCD. OCD is strange. It can show up in the most bizarre, almost funny ways. I would never judge someone for the intrusive thoughts they experience or the compulsions they feel compelled to perform. But I do judge OCD itself, constantly amazed by how incredibly creative and weird the human brain can be in linking these thoughts and actions. Story 19. I'm not a licensed therapist, but I work as a behavioral health technician, which basically means I have a psychology degree. I was trained in behavioral intervention techniques for children and worked on coaching parents to support children with behavior disorders. Here's what I found. I rarely encountered a child with a clear mental illness in the same way I did when working with adults with serious mental health issues. A lot of times, these kids were visibly confused or lonely. Many of their parents were dealing with the burdens of poverty, and I'm convinced that alleviating those financial pressures would have likely reduced the severity of many of the children's symptoms. Advocating for affordable childcare and livable wages is a form of mental health advocacy. I did find myself judging, not the children, but their parents. Some parents would drop off their kids with a "fix my kid" attitude and leave. As a parent now, I get some of it. Exhaustion and burnout are real. But the best I could do in those situations was offer the child an hour of what it looked like to be in a loving, structured environment. Those were the kids who I worried would end up stuck in the system for most of their lives. caught in cycles of institutionalization, homelessness, or prison. When a concerned parent came in and asked, "How do I help my kid?" I practically jumped for joy for that child, because they had someone who loved them and was willing to fight for them. Story 20. Actual licensed therapist here. I agree with what someone else mentioned. I really don't judge my clients. We're trained to step away from that kind of thinking. Most people who get into this field, at least the ones who should, there are plenty of therapists I wouldn't trust with a loved one, are naturally open-minded to begin with. That said, if some of my family or friends had made the same choices that clients have shared with me, I'd probably judge them because I'm in a subjective position. As a therapist, though, my role is to remain objective. That's why people seek therapy in the first place. This doesn't mean I haven't had moments where I think, holy crap, this is wild, but that's not the same as judgment. It's a weird but awesome job. There's a difference between judgment and expressing concern. It's all about how you word it, as you don't want the person to feel judged. If they do, you risk losing their trust and their willingness to be vulnerable with you. If you find yourself struggling with not judging a client and can't resolve your own feelings, that's when it's important to refer them to someone else who can be more beneficial to them. Story 21. I guess I do judge sometimes, but not the patients with serious issues. I find it much harder to be a good therapist for clients who are upset about things like, "I'm so upset my husband only lets me have $10,000 a month for shopping," or "My kid gets B grades and I'm so upset," or "I feel so depressed because my favorite TV show is off the air." I understand that these might be the most significant issues in their lives, and I believe everyone who seeks help deserves it, but I'll admit, I do judge. And I know that's not right. To balance that, I've started working with veterans and offenders, as I feel more useful in those contexts and never feel like I'm judging them. I feel like I'm serving my country and helping prevent serious crimes. Now that I've written this out, I realize I have some personal work to do on myself. Story 22. During my graduate program, in a first semester class, our professor asked us to reflect on our personal values and share any clients we might feel uncomfortable serving. One classmate openly said, "Gay people," because he was personally disgusted by them. Another shared that her religious beliefs would prevent her from working with a client considering an abortion. The professor acknowledged their honesty, gently reminded them of their responsibilities under the NASW Code of Ethics, but ultimately affirmed their right to refuse certain clients. He explained that if they held implicit biases, they could potentially do more harm than good. Fast forward a year to my internship, where I was assigned weekly one-to-one sessions with a client who had rejected all of her previous therapists at the agency. I was told I was the perfect fit, but wasn't told why. It quickly became apparent when I met the client. She was a white supremacist, and I'm white. All of the other therapists she had worked with were either Latino or African American. After the session, I scheduled a meeting with my on-site supervisor. I explained that I was assigned to work with a white supremacist and that her ideology directly conflicted with my core values. I shared that I couldn't continue seeing her because I felt a deep sense of disgust toward her beliefs. I expected to be thanked for my honesty and for the client to be reassigned, just like the classmates in my first-year class who had been open about their discomfort. Instead, I faced significant pushback. I was told that I would need to serve this client, and that it would be a learning and growth experience for me. If I wanted to keep my internship and complete my required hours, I had no choice. It turned out to be an incredibly difficult and traumatic year. Story 23. When I was a teenager, I lived in a household that was emotionally and mentally abusive. I know some people don't fully understand how damaging that can be, but it got so bad that I was later diagnosed with PTSD by a psychiatrist. One day, my parents and I got into a verbal argument while driving. My stepdad pulled over, stopped the car, and told me, "Get out, we're leaving you here." I wasn't scared because I knew I could call the police, tell them I was abandoned, and they would be in serious trouble. So I responded, "Sounds good," and got out. My mom then followed me out of the car and attacked me. I refused to get back in, and in response, my stepdad dragged me by my hair, called me a bipolar bitch, and threw me back in the car. They then made me see a therapist, telling her that I jumped out of a moving car and attacked my mom when she was just trying to help. The therapist didn't believe me and even suggested I take bipolar medication. I knew I wasn't bipolar, I was being abused, and I understood that the anger and sadness I felt were normal reactions to my situation. She looked at me, said, "You're not nearly as smart as you think you are," and after that, I stopped speaking in our sessions. I would just sit there, and she'd make sarcastic comments before dismissing me. She wasn't trying to help me, she was trying to help my parents. I moved out when I turned 18, went to college on my own with no financial support from my family, got a job, and eventually left the country to be as far away from them as possible. I now take antidepressants to manage my PTSD, and fortunately, the therapists I've had since then have been nothing like that awful woman. But even now, it still upsets me deeply when I think about that experience. Story 24. I'm not a therapist, but my poor mum only recently sought therapy for the disturbing things she experienced as a child, and I could tell her therapist had a holy crap moment. My mum and her family fled to Australia when she was 6, escaping Northern Ireland in the early 70s. Her parents were both involved with the Ulster Defence Association, UDA. They fought the IRA during the Troubles. My grandmother was a significant figure in the UDA and has killed people. While sharing some of this with her therapist, the therapist tried to downplay the experience, suggesting they were probably just accountants. My mum had to respond, saying, "Well, why did we flee to Australia after being involved in blowing up a bus? And why were their guns hidden in our teddy bears?" The therapist was left speechless, not knowing what to say next. Story 25. Patient here. I went to a therapist to work through some stress, insecurities, and similar issues. During one session, I mentioned how I feel lonely and touch-starved because my family isn't really affectionate, and I haven't had a proper hug from my mom in I don't know how long. I said I just wanted some genuine hugs and physical connection. The therapist responded with, "Oh well, at least once a day my 18-year-old daughter comes up to me, sits on my lap, and hugs me when she's sad or something because I'm a mother like that, and that's just how it is in my house." I was like, okay, good for you for having a close relationship with your daughter, but that's not why I'm here. Honestly, my sessions with her started feeling more like catching up with an old friend who's bragging about her life. She would talk and rant the entire time, while I had to pay €80 per session for the privilege. Story 26. Parents who abandon their adopted or foster children after years of care, simply because they no longer want to deal with their mental health struggles. Parents who fail to understand that taking away all forms of technology and forcing kids to do nothing but Zoom all day isn't a healthy solution. Social isolation is a major issue right now, and it's a significant factor in the rise of suicide. Parents and clients who don't believe in mental health, thinking that everyone is just faking it, should snap out of it, or my personal favorite, it's just a phase. Story 27. Licensed art therapist here. An important thing to note is that therapists are specifically trained to approach therapy without judgment. However, we do have two key concepts to be mindful of: transference and countertransference. Transference. This refers to when a client redirects feelings about a significant person in their life onto their therapist. Countertransference. This is when a therapist's personal feelings or reactions are triggered by a client. That said, I've certainly experienced strong countertransference in my work. For example, I've worked with clients who hold very different political views, clients who believe the pandemic is a hoax, and clients who have a history of abusive behavior. If I were having casual conversations with someone outside of therapy, I might pass judgment on those views, but in the therapeutic setting, it's different. The most important thing to remember as a therapist is that the person sitting in front of you is human. They are there because they want to explore and work through their internal struggles. They are being vulnerable, opening up, and allowing you a glimpse into their mind and life. Our role is to respect that vulnerability and create a space for them to grow without judgment. Story 28. I'm a therapist. Honestly, I've never had a moment where I've criticized someone internally for their past, or even for the choices they're currently making. Therapy doesn't work that way, and I can't do my job properly if I'm being self-righteous or projecting my own biases onto someone. That said, I do have emotional reactions to people's stories, and I suppose you could argue that's a form of judgment. However, I disagree. The way the OP phrased their question seems to imply more of a "what's wrong with you" kind of judgment, which I don't experience. I can't ignore my own reactions to the people I work with. The idea of checking your emotions at the door is unrealistic in therapy. If you ever meet a therapist who claims to be completely objective, run. That's just not how people work. For example, when a girl tells me her mom died and she doesn't feel sad about it, am I supposed to suppress my sense of pity? Or when parents of a disabled child express relief after their child passes away, am I judging them in a critical way? Absolutely not. Do I feel sad or pity? Yes, I do. Or when I work with a guy who's so close to realizing that his partner's anxiety isn't about him, am I going to get angry with him? No. But part of being a responsible and competent therapist is acknowledging these emotional reactions. If I try to suppress them completely, they'll show up in other ways, potentially affecting the work I'm doing. As a therapist, it's crucial to stay aware of how I'm reacting to what I'm hearing. If I need to, I can consult with colleagues, in an ethical and confidential manner, of course, to process my feelings. Once I've worked through that, I can return to the work with a clearer mindset. I genuinely love the process of change, and being honest with myself about my reactions is a challenge. But I would never want to find myself being critical of someone who's doing the best they can with what they have. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.